Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Well, Scott, thank you for joining me today. It's nice to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Definitely. I've been somewhat deep diving your work to some degree over the last couple weeks and months, actually, and I first started going down the light rabbit hole through Dr. Jack Kruse when he was on Rick Rubin's podcast quite a while back. And he did like a 7-hour two-part series with Andrew Huberman, and it was really interesting. And then I listened to that twice, and it's one of those ones where Dr. Kruse is so intelligent, and he's speaking another language to me. So I had to go a little further, and it led me to other books and podcasts. And anyway, the most important part of it is that I shifted my behavior. And it was so profound to start just to remember that this obvious thing that's right in front of us, light, and it's so important for our bodies and our health. It's weird how we overlook it. And I was just like everybody else, just forgot about it as a major part of my life. So now I'm climbing up on the roof for sunset and sunrises every day at work, and the guys think it's so funny, but it's just part of my life, just like brushing my teeth now. And I've made it to where, like, just before this conversation, I got out and got exposed to the sun as much as I could, and I try to be outside as much as I can now. And I think that's the behavior shift that I'd like to see more people get from this conversation, and why. So anyway, that's why we're here, is to get the behavior shift and the belief system shifts in place. And it's a profound subject. So here we are.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It really is amazing that sunlight, it's the largest energy input into the body and has been for millions of years. Yet we tend to ignore it and don't even really understand what it is. We have kind of like a particular definition where somebody went out in the field and pointed a meter at the sun and said, "This is what sunlight is." And yet, when you start looking at it, we have evolved in this beautiful blue sky that surrounds us. It's changing the spectrum around. It's doing things, creating different chemicals in the atmosphere, things of that nature. And we totally, for whatever reason, don't see it as being something that's important. So, yeah. I hope that that if one thing it does, what we're trying to do does change people's behavior, because I keep on saying I'm probably the worst marketer of any product in the world, because I keep on telling everybody, why don't you first just go outside and walk around a little bit, and then we can talk about whether or not you need a lamp or want to do something inside, which I do believe you can do things to improve indoors. But getting outdoors is even in the winter, you're having some benefit. And that, unfortunately, I think people got scared off by the dermatologists. I don't think there's really any negative intent. They were looking at their one particular parameter, but it's unfortunate that people have this fear of sunlight, and now we have a fear of blue light. And every time we have a fear, it's like we take away something that is important. We don't focus on the part that's causing the problem. We focus on removing more of the other stuff that's supposed to be there to fix the problem. So that's what I find frustrating about the whole process.
And I'd love to learn about the blue light part throughout the conversation. Everybody's wearing the blue blockers, and then what the unintended consequences can be from just doing something so narrowly focused. And then there's so much to get into, because I've heard you speak quite elaborately on this subject, and I'd like to get into as much as we can. But the company that you own, it's called Nira Lighting. I got on your website a while back and filled my cart up with your bulbs. And I'm curious, like, how you got into this rabbit hole and got so obsessed the way you did with this subject matter and became such an expert in the field, because now I'm walking around with your podcast in my ears, and other people, what's her name? Alexis Cohen, you were on her podcast.
Yeah.
And she blew my mind too when I listened to her on Danny Jones. And I'm like, God, there's some people that are extremely knowledgeable in this field. And when you start to get into it, now all of a sudden I'm a weirdo in the culture when it comes to like just being at the firehouse and talking about light. They're like, "What the hell are you talking about?" And it's there's such a huge gap between just the average folks that want to make the behavior shift or even start to learn about it to the folks like you who are deep in it. So I'd like to
Yeah.
start bridging that gap.
Well, I mean, that's what I guess the one thing I love is discovery. I mean, that's what I do. I've been an inventor for a lot of years. I've got 85 issued patents um, in various different fields. And more importantly, I've been able to work with a wide range of really, really smart people. You know, when you're an independent inventor like me, you go and you go talk to the best thing to do is go talk to the expert and learn how to talk to them. And that's one of the things that, just a little side note on this whole thing, is that is my biggest fear with what's going on with this disinformation and things of that nature. It used to be I would go to a university and I'd talk to a professor about some paper he wrote 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And he said, "You actually read it?" I said, "Yeah, I read it. And here's the things I'm interested in." And, that's kind of going away because a lot of these universities have figured out that, hey, that research can be worth money or patents or something like that. And they're even making some of these professors sign NDAs. So it makes it very hard for this whole discovery process that used to be, in my opinion, the hallmark of the country. And it's a sad thing that they're doing. And the other thing is that I think the one thing people need to really get, or I believe in, is that when you look at a paper, you're actually looking for the places where they're wrong, not for the places where they're right. What's the underlying assumptions? Because that's where the next discovery comes from. They made some assumption in there, or they had some mistake in how they were doing it. So people need to get a little bit of humbleness going on with some of their work. Number one, make it more readily available. And number two, or number three, the government needs to get the heck out of the way so that we can do discovery. And it's messy. It's not something that you can just say, "Oh, this is the way you do it." And I once remember I was sitting there at the research center. I was engineer with 350 PhDs around me, and they were trying to figure out how to make money out of the research center. And one day one of the accountants came up and he said, "Well, how many patents are you going to file this year?" And I looked at him, I started laughing, and it was not a good career move to laugh at the guy at the time. But it's just that's the thing about it, and that's why I hope that people look at what we say and what I say in particular as being something. Prove me wrong. I'm happy with that. Show me where I missed it. And the our light sources are not perfect, but they're the closest match to sunlight, and they're based on the assumption that sunlight is the proper thing for us to be in, which I 100% believe. And I think that's why you're seeing so many issues associated with people start as blue blockers and near infrared panels and all this other stuff, because they're looking for that one perfect fix. We want that one thing. If I eat apples all day, am I going to be better than anybody else? And blah blah blah. Where it's really trying to get what works for you and fixes your particular problem, because all of us are a little bit different, especially when you look at the optical world. But and case in point, you said you wanted to talk about blue just briefly. I got this beautiful blue sky around me, and you know the problem is not that blue is bad. We live hundreds of years underneath a blue sky that's orders of magnitude higher than you blue I'm getting exposed to out of this computer or out of my cell phone. What the problem ends up being is that blue is not the same as the blue that's in your screen. That blue is mostly made up of near infrared. And you just have to measure it, and you'll see that there's this huge tail that runs out. And if nothing else, I think that we can honestly say that the real fundamental difference is that without that near infrared tail, blue is bad. And when somebody's wearing a blue blocker, sitting there watching a TV, I don't think they're wrong. But what are they doing? They're reducing blue, increasing the red to ratio so that you're getting the balance. When you're outdoors, you're always exposed to predominantly near infrared, even when you're looking at a blue sky. And, you know, and that blue sky actually has a bunch of UVA and a bunch of UVB that's being scattered into the thing. In fact, the majority of the UV that's coming to our body is actually from the blue sky, not from the direct sunlight. Um, if it wasn't, we'd be in trouble because anytime you got in the shade, you wouldn't be getting. But but because we're in this hemisphere of blue light and UV light, it's coming in from all angles, and we get a higher probability of absorbing it and using it to make vitamin D. So, like I say, I mean, I think the biggest issue is that we need to understand what sunlight really is, and we need to be using it and not underestimating. Maybe you have a better answer of why people tend to ignore sunlight. I for the life of me, can't figure it out. I mean, even if you look at all these people looking at blue zones, they'll list everything under the sun but the sun. You know, it's got all the, yet you look at these blue zones, they're at 73 degrees north, 17 degrees north, very temperate climates, lots of trees around you reflecting near infrared, easy to get outside and be outside on a long-term basis. So there's all these things that sunlight brings to the table, but for some reason it's just never on the list.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like with the breath, when I discovered breath work, which is a really popular term right now, but this was like 14 years ago when I hurt my back, I found yoga. And when I found yoga, it led me to breathing and connecting with the breath. And I thought, holy shit, this is like the most simple thing that's right under my nose, literally, that I've never really paid attention to. And it's the number one thing that manages your nervous system and helps you to be more present. And there's all these benefits to it. So I became literally just like with the sun. These are the two most obsessive things I've found, literally, because, and of course, trying to get good sleep habits and those types of fundamental, basic, natural patterns. But I think this trumps food. The more I'm looking at how much minimal sun exposure we have, and I think you mentioned that it's like the largest experiment in human history of um, solar reduction as far as
Mhm.
us being able to be exposed to the sun. It's like 93% of the time indoors. That's a terrible idea to go all of human history being outside in nature to now being completely indoors for most people's jobs, or if we're just going out to eat, I'm always looking for a patio now, or but I don't know why. I can't imagine. I think it's just because we're so busy, maybe, and we get so caught up on other things that we take it for granted. And it's the same thing with the breath. So I almost correlate those two together now, because now I teach breath work, because I know that 99% of the people that I don't do it to yogis. I teach it to the average person, like a plumber, a teacher, a doctor, just people. And I just help them connect with the breath and start to feel it so that they can build a relationship with it and start to implement it more into their life. And I feel like with the sun and just getting outside more, it's going to be the same weird thing where you do it first. You make sure it's like truly a habit that works, but it's so obvious that we need to get outside more.
Yeah,
And
and it's just strange. I like that analogy. And if you can ever get a hold of RFK Jr. and tell him to quit worrying about the food as much and worry about the lighting more, I would appreciate it greatly. Because I mean, I'm sitting there. Hello, hello, we're here. And it's sad because for a lot of people, I mean, as I told you before the thing, during COVID, we spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time looking at and modeling the effects of sunlight on disease transfer, and came up with some really great computational fluid dynamic models showing how the various droplets move between two people 6 feet apart. And we put all this together and tried to convince the DOE or the NIAID and DHS to even look at it. And they were so focused on vaccine, not arguing about vaccines. This is a supplement. This is why people who spent out 99% of all the infections transferred indoors. But and it's just so it's so amazing when you look at it, you see that sunlight is more than just the light. What happens is that this blue sky up here is strongly absorbing in the UVC and creating on a circadian pattern uh, germicidal levels of hydrogen peroxide and ozone during the day, essentially Mother Nature's Lysol. We breathe it in. We're having that effect. Then at night, the microbes that are absorbing that sunlight are releasing nitric oxide. So they're literally, sunlight is not only impacting you directly, but indirectly, it is changing the environment we're in. And if you look at it just from a simple standpoint, if you're outdoors, you have a lower probability of transmitting the disease to somebody else. And we did the models of how that worked and showed how sunlight does good with the big droplets, and this reactive oxygen species in the atmosphere did best with the smaller droplets. And then you figured out, then it moved in from that into saying, well, wait a minute, none of this is making it good enough to where what we're seeing. Then you figure out that sunlight is actually changing you and you're the person that you're talking to's body chemistry, to where they're less likely to transfer something to you and you're less likely to get affected by it because it's kicking up various hormones within your body simply from the fact, and other immune responses, simply by the fact that you were outdoors getting the sun rays coming in. What we do? We convinced everybody, go jump in a house and stay there, be safe, and don't go outdoors. Wear a mask when you're outdoors. And I'm kind of going, that's the opposite of what you should be telling everybody. And, it's such a simple response to people, even when you're in higher latitudes or it's cold or whatever. Going out a little bit is kicking up your ability to fight disease. We should understand that. We should, for the next pandemic, so that we can, maybe deal with things a little bit better than what we did last time. Where they say we have 4% of the population that had 25% of the COVID deaths. And what really got me going was I'd done some work with John Luis down in Miami. And, one of the most unfortunate statistics is that an African American was 40 times more likely to die of COVID than a sub-Saharan African who had no vaccine, who had no anything. And again, I'm not against vaccines. I'm just saying there's more going on here than poking people with a bunch of pins. So, anyway.
Yeah, can you go into a little bit of that, how melanated people, they actually need more sun exposure, and how I heard you speak into that and how that can actually be detrimental to them.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, to my knowledge, we're about the only people that ever measured it. Women are people with darker skin color. We range from basically very little, few percent melanin, up to about 43% melanin for someone with very dark skin. Well, in order to get the similar effect, well, let me put it into perspective. There's this region in there, the near infrared, which we can't see, that runs right from the red edge out to about what they call 1200 nanometers. This is non-visible. In that region, someone with dark skin requires up to 3 times the amount of flux or input photons coming through his skin or her skin to stimulate the same level as someone like us with whiter skin. We're more efficient at allowing light to penetrate deeper into the body because they were adapted to an environment that there was a continuous amount of high solar incidence, and that gave them the ability. If I go down in that environment, I end up like a French fry. They're down there and they're doing just fine. When there was the forced migration into the higher latitudes for the black population, it basically put them in a flash of the eye, or history from a history standpoint, or evolution standpoint, into an environment that puts them at a disadvantage. They are not getting near amount of they can walk around buck naked all day in the sunlight in higher latitudes and not generate the same amount of vitamin D that I can generate, just walking around in a pair of shorts. It's just the reality. It's the physics of the problem. And it doesn't make one better, doesn't make one better or worse. It just is what they're struggling with. And I did this work in particular, looking at sunscreens. If you look at it from the optic standpoint, like I say, we can get burned by the UVA and UVB components. And so everybody wants to put some sunscreen on to block it. Well, the reality is that half the reactive oxygen species generated by sunlight is in the UV. The other half is in the high end of the visible. So what ended up happening? We ended up putting people with getting sunscreen, which took care of the redness or the sunburn and made you say, oh, okay, I can sit out here longer. But you're still generating all these reactive oxygen species from the visible portion that isn't blocked by the sunscreen. So we tried to change ratios around, and all of a sudden we're starting to create a problem. Now you add in the black population, and a woman that with dark skin is struggling to generate enough vitamin D because of her skin coloration, because she's strongly absorbing in the UVs. And now you put in all makeup, you put sunscreen in. It's making it that much worse, where she has almost zero chance of getting melanoma because of her skin color. Yet she's now put at higher risk of having low levels of vitamin D. And it's not just the thing that was fascinating to me is that our skin is not just generating vitamin D. People like to focus on vitamin D, but it's generating the components for cortisol. It's generating sex hormones. It's generating all these different material or different molecules that are important to us. And it's doing it in the skin without going back to the adrenal gland or any of those other things. It's doing it right there at the skin, because the skin is having to deal with this influx, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's very complicated in a lot of ways, but there's always these unintended consequences. Nobody in the cosmetic world wanted to. They were trying to protect women from getting skin cancer, but to set up the black woman to have a much be in a worse shape for generating vitamin D was not, I don't think, their intent.
Yeah. And then all the chemicals and stuff that are in most of the sunscreens that then who knows how that interacts with the sun and your skin and all the other unintended consequences we can't really measure.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm really excited, because we're starting to get to the point now that they're starting to develop these new biosensors. And when you're working out, people are measuring this with their watch on it, and sweat rates, salt concentrations. They're now getting to the point that they are pretty soon. We're going to be the point that we can actually measure from sweat melatonin and cortisol and IL-6 and all these different important hormones and cytokines and things like that we haven't been able to measure, but you're measuring it in real time while you're doing your exercise.
Mm.
And that's what I think is super critical, because when we start doing something, all this circadian stuff that we have people talking about is only under very controlled experimental conditions. The minute you do something, or you go outside, you go exercise, you get exposed to sunlight, you're changing the body chemistry around in ways that don't fit into the circadian thing, and actually, you know, are beneficial compared, actually replace in some ways the circadian effects that people are so focused on. But
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I'm curious how much sunglasses and even clear regular glasses like the ones I'm wearing when I'm outside, how much are they filtering out the good effects of the light spectrum, and how much negative effect is coming from wearing sunglasses, and also just being out in the sun, covering yourself up. I've heard you speak to like your skin is actually absorbing way more than what our eyes are. But then I've heard that be a controversial thing, like Andrew Huberman and these guys say you should never wear sunglasses because of POMC. And so I'm curious about the sunglass thing and being covered versus just being outside in general, and how much you're absorbing through your skin, even if you're in the shade.
Well, I mean, there's lots of different things to unpack from that one, I'm afraid. But
Yeah, which
I
is
think,
good.
yeah, yeah. But first, I would make the point that the highest concentration of melanopsin, which is the chromophore that people talk about for circadian, is not in the eye. It's actually in the skin. We basically, evolutionarily, we probably had melanopsin sitting in our skin because, we didn't have eyes way back when we were crawling out of the ocean or whatever. But in the process of, because of that, I'm not convinced that you wake up because you get blue light in the eye. I think you're waking up because you're getting blue light on your skin, and it's responding in various ways. Not saying it doesn't work and it doesn't have, but if you happen to look at any of the tests that they run, they stick their head inside this integrating sphere and bring blue light in, and only a little small portion ends up making it through the pupils, but the
Mm.
rest of the skin is being exposed. So that'll be an interesting thing for people to figure out. But
Mm-hmm.
I think people respond. I think we're responding in different ways to melanopsin. So that's one thing. As far as glasses are concerned, polycarbonate goes out to about 3 or 4 microns or beyond as far as transmission. So that's way into the infrared. So I think that there's nothing particularly wrong with it. Um, you know, from my standpoint, what I think that people tend to miss, or optically, what I think is really interesting is the eye is actually two types of imaging optics. It does light that goes through the pupil, but the majority of light actually doesn't go through the pupil. It actually goes through your eyelids and your sclera because it's a much bigger area and it's just kind of like glass ball.
Mm-hmm.
It's our humerus. And that humerus has actually a larger transmission window in the infrared compared to the visible. And it appears that the function of that is to collect large amounts of near infrared into the retina, which is the highest usage of blood and other things. Uh, so it's essentially needs the extra near infrared. So it actually adjusts the ratio based on the design of your eye to make sure that there's always an excess of near infrared on the retina. And there seems to be some really amazing uh, nanostructures built into the retina itself to control how that light propagates. So, uh, you know, it's not very simple. It's very complex and it's really quite fascinating. But in general, whenever there's a sensitive tissue, be it the gray matter of your brain, the fetus in the womb, or your eye, the body optically is always increasing the ratio of near infrared to visible that those cells are exposed to. And I think it's
Mm.
doing it for a reason. And, if you look at Glenn Jeffrey's work, where he looked at how, just putting a little bit of near infrared into the body caused a systemic change in ATP production for those cells, and then globally across the body for an extended period of time. It's not hard to believe that there are mechanisms that kind of are assuming, as it is always the case in nature, that we are exposed to an excess in the infrared relative to visible at all times. And unfortunately, you can say whatever you want, but the reality is that we indoors, our new environment, our modern society, we took that number and made it zero. There is zero near infrared in most homes, especially if you're sitting down at a computer and have IR near infrared blocking glass on your windows. Open the stinking window. Let a little bit of other stuff in, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think it's oversimplified what Huberman and some of those guys are saying, in my opinion. But
So
that's
if we were going to build schools and hospitals in a way that you could do, like say you could just do it overnight and have RFK understand the stuff that you're talking about and take just as much of a momentous move to make people healthier and make this shift on healthier lighting environments, what would you say are the best changes that could be made for kids and for people in hospitals and for people that work in hospitals and just people in general? What can be done? Obviously, your lighting company is a big part of it, but if you could scale it and make these shifts, what would it be?
well. The first thing, and I think the architects, I hope, are starting to listen to this, is to go back about 150 years. I mean, the reality is that Florence Nightingale was this amazing nurse, but she was a more amazing statistician. And she came up with all these different parameters. And if you look at the hospitals of old, they were what they called pavilion, I believe is what they call them, where the patient was allowed to roll the bed out into the sunlight and roll the bed back. In a lot of cases, the hospitals were designed such that the entire time that you were in there, the windows were open, winter and summer, and used radiated floor heating to keep people from freezing, of course. And the simplest thing that I can think of that people could do besides just wheeling people, and I saw this the other day. I was really kind of heartened. There was a whole row of people in a nursing home, and they'd all been rolled out into the sunlight, and they were all sitting there having nice conversations. And we just did a next space where a woman was talking about how her son going through hospice, fighting fungal infection in his lungs, asked to go outside for the few days he had left. He then recovered. Was it because of the sunlight? Was it because of the joy associated with being out there? I don't know. But it all kind of plays together in the same kind of thing. So simply taking some nursing homes and convincing them to put in clear glass conservatories or a polycarbonate conservatory, or have a window thing that you could put up there that lets some of the longer wavelengths back into the room. I understand we're going to use a little bit of energy, but if that person gets well or that person feels better, it's worth 10 times the amount of energy that you save by doing what we're doing. And and there's so many tricky ways that we can use light tunnels and things of that nature to bring into architecture good light. And then the other thing I do is try and convince everybody to turn the stinking light switch off, you know, because we're doing not only a number to ourselves, but we're doing a number on the insects and all that kind of stuff, and plants. I keep on saying that, people, what happened is that the DOE decided that they were going to make it so energy efficient to have LEDs that they basically made it so that everybody just bought 10 times the amount of LEDs, and put them everywhere rather than turning the lights off and saving some energy that way. Because how many houses do you drive by and every light in the house is open on at night, or they've got all these wonderful uplights going into the trees, trying to give beautiful accents. Yeah, it's pretty, but it's unnecessary. And there's other ways that we could be thinking about it. And so if you could have that, and I think this is part to what you were saying, having that attitude shift to where this matters and is important. I don't want to go squash little kids being able to see Christmas lights and things of that nature, but it's not necessary all the time. And it's not like you're actually going to make yourself safer. People under the glare of some of these LED lights, there are dark areas that you can't see anybody, So, it's not a safety issue as much as it is just we've convinced everybody it's a safety issue, I guess. So again, those are the things I do. And then of course, we're doing the lighting. Our lighting isn't perfect. I do a very simple thing. We combine LEDs with incandescent bulbs in the same package, and you've got some. You see them. I mean, it, that could be made so much better if we could get the industry to accept the fact that we need to add this back in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, new phosphors, maybe even some new LEDs that kind of bridge the gap between the incandescent and the near and the LEDs.
Do you
But
think there's an active push against it for a lot of reasons, whether it be nefarious or just incentivization reasons, or what do you think? Because it's a message that seems so obvious to you and to people that are in the world of understanding this, but it's almost like food. When you look at the FDA right now, the big shift that's happening with RFK going in there and pointing out all these issues, and casein calamines are really hitting it pretty hard, but no one's talking about light. And it's unbelievable because that is the essence of what keeps a house plant healthy. If you just stick it in the middle of your house, not by a window, it's going to be pretty obvious that it's not going to go well for that plant. And we human beings are like little solar panel absorbers, and we're being exposed to so much weird light. So it's an obvious thing. So how do we get the belief system to shift? And what do you think the hangups are? Is it the Rockefellers and the people that want to create sick care? And sometimes it seems very obvious that it's nefarious and that they're driving incentives to create sick people that are weak and sort of numb and suggestible to make profit on the tail end. But that's the hard overarching reach, even if he didn't go to that degree. You just come back and go, maybe it's just incentives and people are confused and they don't know. I'm willing to think about all of it, but
Well, I think that it's a combination of all the above. I mean, I go back to during COVID. I wasn't asking them to ban vaccines. I wasn't trying to say vaccines were bad. I was simply saying there's something else out here that you guys should look at. And it's important because the most effective prevention of diseases is being outdoors. That is a simple fact. And, you know, why is it that way? And we put together various mechanisms that we thought were possible. When I took those to Gates Foundation and other places, they said, well, we don't have time. We're focused on this vaccine. Well, now you got time, you know, and now's the time to actually do it. So I don't know how you get around it. But, you know, shame on us if the next pandemic comes around from bird flu or something like that, and we haven't taken the time to understand what we can do that's more effective than just throwing everybody indoors and sticking them with a bunch of needles. I don't care if they do come up with a vaccine in 2 years or a year or whatever. They should have prevented so many of the deaths in COVID, in my opinion, were preventable, you know, because you start thinking about that transfer rate and infection rate when you're outdoors versus indoors. You're talking about saving millions of people's lives. And it was really frustrating, and it still is frustrating. And
yeah.
I keep on saying that it's like we're last on the list, and we got to go through all these other things before we get back to, okay, well, nature is not stupid and actually figured out some stuff. And that's where I get really frustrated with the whole process. And but I don't know. I guess it takes somebody that's got more oomph than me, or more podcasts. I don't know where they where people start to think about, you know, it's not that hard to run the experiment. It's not that hard, you know. And we they did all the experiments at the very start of the pandemic before the vaccine was around, where they showed that in dark, cool areas, the half life of the virus was on the order of hours. The minute you introduce sunlight into that mix in the controlled environment, it knocked it down to 18 seconds. Okay. Well, it takes about a second to move from one person to the other in 6 feet for a droplet. So, but the difference between it hanging around in an indoor enclosure for up to an hour before it is deactivated to some reasonable level, compared to 18 seconds, you can do the math. It's pretty straightforward, you know. And what we also, like I say, what we also found was, and what I think we're focused on now is that when you're in sunlight, your body is operating in an entirely different homeostasis. Your immune system is elevated. You have all these other things going on, and that make you less susceptible to contracting a disease. I mean, it's kind of logical when you think about it. We go through an environment that is constantly bombarding us with pathogens of all types, and the body has had to adapt. It couldn't wait on, for millions of years, it couldn't wait on Pfizer to come up with a vaccine. It had its own approaches. Were they all successful? No, but it's part of and parcel of our immune response. And that's all I'm saying is that there are things we could be doing, simple things, adding humidification. It turns out that there was a great study by Mayo where they took and put humidity in the classroom, and they showed a 50% drop in flu for those kids during the season. And then you turn around and you think about it. Well, does the water have anything in it? Well, most of the wastewater treatment plants, or a lot of them, have converted from chlorine over to hydrogen peroxide and ozone. So tap water contains the same kind of things that we find out in the atmosphere, being generated every day, you know. and we're breathing it. And I just think it deserves to have some research into understanding, can we add just a little bit of hydrogen peroxide to water that's going into humidifiers in schools and prevent some disease transfer? Can we open up the windows and put in, like I say, some plexiglass panels or whatever to get around all this taking everything to zero? I don't believe that you have to fix everything, but we didn't do that. We took everything to zero in most homes. And that's where I think the real rub comes. And that not being willing to look at other alternatives that are supportive of vaccines, at least at the time when COVID was going on. It was a really frustrating period for me, to be quite honest.
Sure. I think it's waking a lot of people up to just how corrupt and broken our systems are, because there was almost not only just ignorance to it, but the actual attack and censorship of people that were coming forth with ideas like this. So I had Peter McCullough on recently, and as soon as I put his video up on YouTube, within an hour it was removed for medical disinformation. These types of censorship are built into algorithms and AI models that are scrubbing the internet for keywords. And
Yeah.
it's crazy. And then you start to look into Robert Becker's work and Andrew Marino's book. Did you ever read Going Somewhere by Andrew Marino?
No, I didn't.
It's interesting. It's all about this paradigm, but he goes and testifies at Congress about the grid and starts to show that it's having a negative effect on human beings. And so there's an active attack on the scientific research that's being done that shows it's having a negative effect on humans or on the planet for profit or for whatever. And it's unfortunate. That's the stuff that pisses me off too. And I think it's becoming more and more exposed with platforms like X, where Elon buys X and now information's flying. And we're
Yeah.
able to actually see it for the first time. And we saw the last election probably wouldn't have even happened without podcasts and without X being bought. And we wouldn't have RFK in the position that he's in. And I don't know if any of this makes sense to a lot of people right now, if it's like we're all paying attention at once, that there's a huge shift happening and we're all becoming aware of the nefarious and bad elements of who are in power and all these companies in place, or if it's more just an echo chamber and it's not that many people paying attention to it. I feel like there's a lot of hope right now, and there's a lot of people that are aware of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, well, I think there is some nefarious because people get their reputations on the line, but I think mostly it's very difficult. I've been doing this for several years, and it's very difficult to raise awareness of a particular subject if you, given that there is so much focus, especially during COVID, there was so much focus on vaccines. The people were swamped. They were doing everything they could to do it, and I understand that. But in the background, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. But that's not what usually ends up happening. It's like right now we've got this thing where IAQ, we're going to do indoor air quality. Well, if what I believe is right, that's the worst thing you can do. Because what are you doing? You're basically taking and scrubbing the air of all the stuff that I think is good and not bringing in fresh air refurbishment or bring fresh air into the thing, because you're trying to make essentially a sterile environment. The body is not designed to function in a sterile environment. We use some of those pathogens that we're being exposed to are good for us and bad for us and make us, essentially, there's a really interesting paper by Schrodinger where he's talking about how the mutation rate is part of survival. We have to mutate. Unfortunately, I believe what we've done is created an artificial environment that is taking away the important parts and leaving us with, just what we need to see or what we, so, you know, if I could convince anything as far as getting hospitals is to find ways to get more fresh air input into it, and also maybe think about whether or not that air needs to be monitored as being closer to what it is outdoors. You know, imagine you're breathing in only, safety levels are like parts per million. That what happens every day When the sun comes up, is we get a sort of gentle rise in hydrogen peroxide into the parts per billion, and ozone into the parts per hundreds of billion. That's what we're breathing in when we're outdoors. It has a germicidal effect on our lungs, on everything else. I personally believe it's a component in what Henry was dealing with the fungal infection. Can't prove it. I'm not a doctor, but it couldn't hurt, I don't think. And understanding how those naturally occurring things, sunlight, reactive oxygen species, even the microbes releasing nitric oxide. Imagine you're sleeping down on the ground in front of a campfire, and you've got all these microbes releasing nitric oxide during the night, and you got this nice near infrared coming in with almost no blue content. You have beautiful stars above you that are kicking in all kinds of different stuff. I mean, moonlight is even got significant amount of near infrared coming off of it relative when you're talking about ratios relative to blue. So it's this constantly, you can't depend on the absolute because there's 9 orders of magnitude difference in sunlight from bright sun down to dark. Still not 0, but it's a long way, 7, 9 orders. But the ratios are always being maintained. So the body had to depend on something. I believe, like any good engineer, the control system requires both positive and negative feedback, comes back, keeps it in balance. That's what we're doing. And you think about the balance the body is tasked with, what's our body temperature? It maintains it within degrees,
Mm-hmm.
and all across all different kinds of environments. You can't do that just by picking some absolute. It's got to have things in balance. And that, guess that's my gist on it. I don't. I'd like to think that they really, if they had the time, they would do something. But unfortunately, I haven't had anybody call me,
Yeah.
and it's really frustrating when you see what's going on with the space station and the effects that that's having on mitochondrial decay. You're starting to see all these things where we're starting to understand that sunlight is impacting almost every process in the body and changing it when we're out in it. So anyway,
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about the mitochondria because that's something that for most of my life it was this weird word in the far back part that no one talked about. And now when you're getting into this decentralized medical model that people are talking about, it seems like the real focus point of longevity and of health. And what you were saying about us using our environment and then all the unintended consequences that come from shifting one thing, even going inside all the time. Over the last, I think, 10 years, I've had a cold plunge in my house. Because once I found Wim Hof, he made so much sense to me. I'm like, why have I been, every time I get a little cold, I put a hoodie on? And it's like I have to tweak the environment. It's like my body was made to be cold. And when you're cold, you shiver. And when you're hot, you sweat. And so I started going deep into that rabbit hole of cold exposure and like making myself be a little bit uncomfortable if it's cold outside and if it's hot outside, not trying to go inside immediately. It's like we're supposed to be exposed to the environment. It's so much more practical and natural to just get back to the basics, get your feet on the ground barefoot. And people make fun of that you're not, you're grounding. What are you ground? It has to be this woo woo conversation, but you're like, it just makes sense. You're standing on the earth without this little rubber on your feet. So now I go, I'll go catch the sunset, and it's just like, take your shoes off, stick your feet on the grass, do a
yeah,
little bit of breathing, catch a little bit of sun. It's so simple, practical, and it's free. But
yeah,
people act like it's this crazy shift, and it's like, no, it's the simplest stuff. This is actually what keeps you healthy.
yeah. But don't you think that it's probably just there's always the problem that there's always confounding things, like you're grounding yourself. Well, A, you're outside. B, you're putting your feet, which have an entirely different set of sweat hormones or sweat glands in them than your hands or than the rest of your body, in contact with a biochemistry of a lot of different types, microbes, all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does it? I think it's kind of like easy water that Gerald Pollack came up with. I think that the wordage gets in the way of people. It's easy to dismiss in some ways. I believe that Gerald's right, that there is a huge effect on water when it's in close proximity to biological systems. I mean, I was actually trying to do some work in that area a while back, um, but unfortunately, the name gets in the way of what's really the good science that I think he's tried to do. And it's hard to prove, outside of those things, to prove everything beyond a shadow of a doubt. And people have such ingrained views about, it's like the anti-vaxxers. They were vilified, you know. I can make a very good argument. I spent a lot of years at the research center working on nanoparticles. One of the cardinal rules of nanoparticles was is that they go everywhere. Now all of a sudden we put RNA in a nanoparticle, lipid nanoparticle, shoot it into a muscle, and it goes all these different places it was never intended to go. You know, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that's the problem, but I'm just saying that's the reality of putting it in nano versus a whole cell that's basically stayed in your muscle. You know, did Fauci look into that? Did he put that to the test? I don't know. But that was my concern in the whole thing. Not
Yeah.
claiming it's right or wrong, just saying there's always some. I come back to this whole thing that people put way too much, especially the news media, put way too much stock into some of these papers that are published by accredited people and not understand that there's a blackboard solution and then there's a real world solution, and a lot of times the blackboard solution can't take into account all the different things that are necessary and is oversimplified. So
Yeah,
anyway,
the centralized model is the problem, it seems like, because of all the funding and the people that own, like you said, the patents and the research and the direction of where we're going. Even for something as simple as like the windows in houses, it's going to be real hard to get people that are highly vested in companies for, years and years to make that shift, because right now they're blocking all of the good light that you'd want coming into your house, you
yeah,
know?
and you know it, it is frustrating because, and I can understand it. People have invested tons. I mean, millions and millions of dollars have gone into circadian lighting. And in my opinion, if you're getting the proper amount of near infrared, you don't circadian is not the problem. When you're not getting the proper amount of near infrared, it absolutely is the problem. And people should probably wear blue blockers when they're not getting the right amount of the right ratios, because that's all you're doing. You're just suppressing the blue so that it's more in line with the amount of red. Why don't the LED manufacturers add red? Because the minute they add red, that means that their lumens per watt goes down. Now they double down. They have this 120 lumen per watt rule change that Biden put through that's going to be enacted in 2028. It basically mathematically negates my ability to provide someone with a light bulb like you have that has a significant amount of near infrared. Is it based on any science? No, it's not based on any science. And I find it frustrating, and that's like I say, I mean, the DOE, I'm hopeful that they will look at some of these regulations and ask the question, are these helping people or hurting people? And I think if they do that, then you'll see a lot of them go away. That said, the industry, lighting industry in particular, has put tons of money into LEDs, and they know that they can't add enough red to get back to sunlight without giving up their number one thing, which is lumens per watt. If you try and do what we do with our light bulb with LEDs only, you're going to end up at about 10 lumens per watt. And that's just the reality, 20 to 10 to 20 lumens per watt, which was the same as an incandescent. Why did I change from an incandescent? You know, we make a
Yeah.
compromise using a hybrid approach that makes it so that you can do 40, 50, maybe 60 lumens per watt. But in 2028, I'm not going to be able to sell that because it's not 120 lumens per watt, which by definition makes it very blue, very high in the shorter wavelengths, and everybody's going to walk around with blue blockers. My biggest complaint about blue blockers is I don't want my children or my grandchildren not being able to see Starry Nights by Van Gogh are, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you eliminate blue from their life? It's kind of like making them all wear masks so that they couldn't tell whether or not what their facial expressions were. You're
Hmm.
removing some necessary component. Blue has been around forever. Done right, it's just as safe as any other wavelength, but done wrong, it can be, as I say, harmful. I totally agree with them. It's not a good thing, and I know people that get real benefit from wearing blue blockers, but if they had the right light sources, they wouldn't need the blockers, I don't think.
So do you wear them when you're inside watching a TV at night, or do you wear them at all, blue blockers, or when you're outside on like right now, you're outside on a computer screen, so there's no need because you're getting all of the other spectrums which counterbalance it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I believe. And when we're
Hmm.
watching TV, I have either incandescent or light bulbs on around it. If I could just convince everybody to put a little desk lamp next to their computer or a couple of them,
Hmm.
our bulbs put out 4.5 optical watts of near infrared, you know, and for every 1.5 optical watts of visible. So you're basically flooding that area with, and it's bouncing off the keyboards. As Glenn said, this stuff bounces everywhere. What is going on? Because it does. I mean,
Hmm.
indoors, there's a lot of surfaces that are reflecting. The other thing, I guess, that I think people, there's this thing about, oh, we're going to bring plants indoors. We're going to do all this green stuff and all the benefits of plants. Well, and they have these plant walls. Well, they're sitting there looking. The sunlight is coming in that they need, but it's coming in through something that's blocking all the near infrared component. So the main attribute or benefit of plants, in my opinion, is that kicking back the near infrared. Well, if you don't let them expose them to any near infrared, you're not getting that benefit. So it's kind of
Mm.
like, you know, there's a lot of, you look at a lot of the solutions, and they're solutions that are done because we're not willing to do what nature does in the first place,
It's
and let the
amazing.
light in.
Yeah, there's
So,
so many little things that we do. It seems like I can think of like Bill Gates. He's an obvious person to focus on when it comes to the way he wants to control soil, even, or something
yeah,
like that. And the centralized model again, it's like, well, there's people in India that have been fighting him for years. Vandana Shiva has been fighting his seed patenting for years, and people write her off as a whack job, and she's a brilliant physicist. And she sees the problem that's going to happen if you come in and you start to own the seeds. And it's just like we do that with everything. It seems like we're so focused on one little part and we don't look at the ripple effect that it has on the whole system and realize everything's interconnected.
yeah,
And so,
I totally agree, and it's frustrating because you know we have the science, but the money gets in the way of a lot of the science. One of the things, because of my primary motivation, is to eventually understand what effect this is having on kids' cancer. That's one of my big goals. Um, but understanding along the way, you see all these things that we're doing wrong that are so unnecessary. You know, it's like the lighting industry is focused on circadian. Okay, well, they're trying to do it simply by using 400 to 700 nanometers. Number one. Number two, they're trying to do it just by shifting the light wavelengths so it goes from blue to orange or red. You know, but that's not what nature does. I mean, we're getting ready for sunset here before, down the way here, if I can see it. But if you're here at sunset, you see, oh, there's this beautiful orange glow right in front of me. Look left, look right. It's all blue, you know? So it's not the wavelength change that is really impacting your circadian. What is impacting your circadian is the dimming range. And that's
mm,
what the LED manufacturers don't want to have to do, because they don't have good methodologies in order to dim over an entire range and change the color at the same time. That's what we do with our light source and the new DC one we're working on. But, it's really that change from daylight, we're bright, a lot of light, even in the shade, 10,000 lux, whatever, all the way down to zero point zero 0.01 lux. Turn the light off, get dark. That's what really defines circadian to me, at least. And all these games of just trying to shift colors, it's just, you know, entertainment more than trying to actually affect your health. Can they make show an effect? Yeah, absolutely, they can show effect. You put somebody in a dark room, don't bother them, get them all set. You can see a change in melatonin and cortisol. I can see a change in melatonin and cortisol, you know, doing exercise. I can change a lot of different ways. And unfortunately, they don't make the list that people are concerned about.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about AC and DC and the difference and how different the whole grid is and everything is just because of that in itself?
Yeah, it'd be great. I mean, AC, most people, homes have 120-volt AC here, 220-volt, 50 hertz over in Europe. Um, Way back, real reasons that we did it way back when. Unfortunately, that introduces some level of what we call flicker in any system. And, you know, we've been working on trying to get it down to where we can provide an AC product that just screws in. And we've got it now down to about 2% flicker, which is actually less. The old incandescent bulbs, when you screw them in, they actually had flicker on them, but they were mostly near infrared, so it didn't affect you as much. And there were some benefits associated with the incandescent as far as time response. But everything that's doing AC, alternating current, has some level of flicker in it. And the industry has defined, I think, 30% modulation as being considered flicker free. It's a marketing
Mm.
thing more than anything else. Um, so we've been working to get it down to about zero. The alternate approach is to do what we call direct current, DC. And for the longest time, that was not usable indoors because you couldn't deliver enough power to run your washing machine, all those other stuff, or even the lighting, because it took quite a bit of energy to do incandescent bulbs. So, and then they do other things to it as far as dimming and things of that nature. But in DC, which is what I am really hoping we eventually get to and what we sell our lamp based on, there is no modulation. It is a direct current. It's 48 volts DC,
Mm.
and then you dim that down to zero, and you do what I call an analog voltage dim. So it's all analog type thing, kind of like the difference between having a record player and the new digital, forms. You're always making some compromise in things, but reality is that when we're outdoors, we are existing in an analog world. It's not digitized. Even your picture on your TV is a digital representation of what's outdoors, so there is some flicker associated with you simply watching TV. And it's modulating just a little bit the intensity of that light. Now, what the problem is that if you look at it from the standpoint of being outdoors, other than the rock slide or the tiger being ready to eat you, uh, modulation, leaves wiggling, trees, branches moving a little bit, is about 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. Everything that we do now in our indoor environment has some level of this flicker, but it's at a higher frequency. So that, if you've got a bulb and you screw it in, you get 120 hertz component. If you look at Philips Hue, they use pulsing to actually get the color variations. They're at 1,000 hertz.
Mm.
Fluorescence used to be at 10,000 hertz. And for some people, they can tell a difference. I know this one lady that was very nice. She could tell the difference between our AC bulb and our DC bulb when we were doing what I felt was not as good a job, what we're doing. So now we have a new version that I'm going to send to her, and hopefully she can not tell a difference between those. But, layered on top of all these things of spectrum is this other effect that we are essentially around flashing lights. And I keep on saying that the mafia knew this long ago. If you go to Vegas, you walk into the casino floor, what do you
Mm.
see? You see a bunch of flashing lights, bright lights, a bunch of noise, ding, 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 and all this other stuff, and a lot of alcohol. And they know exactly that makes them more money because what it does is it kicks up your cortisol levels and makes you less risk averse. So, they are compounding on top of everything else that we're doing. And so your TV, and When I was growing up, the TV was a little thing like this, black and white. It was actually defocused a little bit, so it was a little more smoother. Now we've got these big screen TVs that actually represent the majority of light in a lot of your rooms, especially at night. And they're high contrast, high frequency, 240 or higher frequency range, with all kinds of, like I say, really high contrast images. And you can kind of just see it in your kids. I mean, once the TV guys have got it down to a science as far as what locks your children in. You can't break them loose from that unless you physically pick them up and move them. In some cases, I have a little granddaughter, and she's 1, and we turn all the TVs off when she's around, because I mean, if she literally sees one, she'll just crank her head and she'll lock onto it. And so I believe that there's lots of things going on. And like there was this really great study, I thought, by Professor Light in Alberta, and he showed that he was measuring the cell wall potential of individual cells and then shining lights on them. And he was able to show that cell wall potential in all our cells is essentially being modulated up into the kilohertz region by the flashing lights.
Mm.
So, do we understand what it's all doing? No, we don't understand what it's all doing, but they're all compounding into creating this artificial environment that is not anything close to what we have outdoors. So,
It seems terrible for your health to be exposed to that much light, especially as a child. And you went into the Vegas thing. I heard Dr. Jack Cruz speak about that being a part of the MK Ultra thing back in the day. I don't know if it really gets into that or not, but using that information and then using that to then plug into the computer technology and going, oh, this is actually what keeps people addicted and hyper focused and suggestible at all times. And then you buy out all the other computer companies that have the other light spectrums, and it's always like, geez, there's so much you could possibly get into here. But
well, yeah, it's funny. Bob and I are sitting there talking, and I keep on reaching back to the back of my head to see if I got something plugged in there that I didn't know.
yeah,
But, but it is amazing how powerful the effect of light can be. And, we just take it for granted because we can walk outside and it's light, or it's dark. But um, it's sad now what we're doing at night. Um, I grew up in an area where you could see the Milky Way. Um, Unfortunately, I don't know how we get around that. Yeah, you can go take some remote areas and you can make them sanctuaries or whatever you want to call them.
hmm
But it really is boiling down to people need to start turning off lights and it's not just for us. I growing up in Kansas, you'd be driving down the road and your windshield would always be covered with bugs, associated when I was growing up. Now I can't remember last time I got saw a grasshopper or anything coming and hitting my windshield. And so I think we're doing a lot more damage than we give it credit for. And it may be more serious than some of the concerns over energy and climate change. I mean, we're already doing change. It's called killing off a large portion of the insect population, and where you have to ship honeybees to California to pollinate the fields. That's kind of getting a little bit concerning, I think. So, you know,
yeah, it's
but
crazy.
but you can't go too far. They call you a quack, and you know.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
been called a quack plenty of times. There is a cool place here called Portal, Arizona, way in South Arizona, where people can go and there's no light pollution because they have laws there and rules within that community. And so all these physicists and people that use their telescopes go and move out there. And so
Hmm.
it would be nice if more of the world could have access to seeing the stars again, because we forget that there's even stars up there. It's so light polluted in the city. And it's such a part of just the relationship to being human, the awe and the wonder and the
Hmm.
humility factor. That's a big part of our mental health too, is that we're just so narrowly focused and we don't have the broader focus, and our interconnectedness gets torn, that relationship.
Well, you think so many ways that the skies have affected civilization over the centuries, and now that's kind of all going away. It's kind of like being able to have your kid go work on a car. You know, unless he's got a computer hookup, he's not going to do squat. Versus tearing apart an old VW and putting it back together. It's something that's being lost, I think, in a lot of ways. So,
Yeah.
and yeah, but that said, I am quite heartened because there are people like yourself and others that are younger generation that I think are mainly through social media, are really starting to pick up on things that I think are really important. I mean, I went through it all and I'm still, you know, A, overweight, B, I mean, I even know what I'm supposed to do. But your generation, I think, has got an opportunity to not go into the little rabbit hole that I went into. And I'm really hopeful because I think that, you know, especially given the fact that this generation will be the first generation that is exposed to all these negative effects, the fact that they're going to maybe think about it a little bit more, and maybe have some other options, is a good thing. I am concerned that, like I say, that this is going to be the first generation that has been exposed to basically zero near infrared and various and convinced that going outdoors is bad. I mean, I literally would come home and you'd go out until the streetlights came on, type thing. And that doesn't happen very much anymore in a lot of places. So I think it's something we need to get the information out to and
Hmm.
let parents make good choices. I know it's convenient to take little Johnny to the karate studio and drop him off and walk over and get a latte at the Dunkin' Donuts. But it's time to kind of think about, well, maybe little Johnny needs to get outdoors and have a play date, type thing, or Sally or whoever.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that is true from an optic standpoint. Children are much more susceptible to these changes than we are as adults. A higher percentage of their cells are engaged in sunlight, are influenced by sunlight. They have all their hormones going off on left and right anyway. So take whatever effect you find and double it or triple it, and that's the effect it's having on children. And especially in males. I mean, not to be biased towards one or the other, but males, testosterone is defined in a great extent by their exposure to being out in sunlight. And I think we're struggling with a lot of boys having issues with their testosterone levels. Um, so,
Yeah. I've even noticed with me since I've made this paradigm shift, just like when I did with the breath, how much I got bang for my buck in the first 10% of the journey. You make a couple quick shifts, and all of a sudden you get 80% of the return by not changing a whole lot. And I started to do that with more getting outside more often, and my energy levels are up, up, up. And I just feel so much healthier and more vibrant, and my vitality is way better. And I think that gyms and yoga studios and indoor cycling, all that stuff pretty much is like gone. If you were in my consciousness now, I'm like, why would I go under this false lit gym, and indoor cycle or be on a treadmill or be in a yoga studio even if I can be outside breathing fresh air? You're actually going to get more benefit just walking outside.
I
But
think so. And yes, there are all these other effects, and I'm sure that RFK Jr. can uh, will hopefully take care of some of the issues with the food supply. But there's millions of diets all across the world, and we all live about the same amount of time. A little up and down here and all that. I think that sunlight, you see what's happening in Africa, and you're seeing this huge shift in their various negative health aspects, um, where they're adopting Western lifestyle. They're not only adopting the Western food lifestyle, but they're mainly adopting time spent indoors lifestyle. And everybody wants to watch their TV, sit on their computer, all this other stuff. And I'm not so sure that we aren't exporting a bad example to developing countries. especially for those groups that are in with dark skin. I mean, whether you like it or not, they have a much stronger connection to the sunlight, or need a much stronger connection to the sunlight than we do. We migrated over centuries up to higher latitudes. You know, we see seasonality in our diseases. That's one of the things I think is so cool about the work we were doing. I published a paper on seasonality and the effect of reactive oxygen species. And, you know, clearly there we have a higher affinity or a much higher likelihood of catching diseases in certain low light level conditions. Okay, why do people migrate to Florida? Older people, they go, they're going down there for a good reason. They may say it's warm or it's nice or whatever, but they're actually physiologically changing how their body's reacting, and they have a lower probability. There was this really interesting effect when the first part before the vaccines came out, where I was looking at COVID deaths, and for the first time there was a biannual flu season that occurred during COVID. What happened is that you most of the time you see a spike up in the winter and the spring. You have the tail off. But what you'll notice if you look at the data, the during the summer months, Arizona, where you're at, and Nevada and Texas and Florida actually saw an increase in COVID deaths during the summer. Now, they had at the same time you could look at Italy and Spain, and they didn't have that jump up. Now, observational, whatever you want to call it, but those at that particular point in time, 95% of all the air conditioning units were in those lower states of the U.S. And over in Europe, they would open a window. Mm. That's what they do. They didn't see the bump. We did. And that's what my concern is with this IAQ is that we're going to try and create this better environment that is actually going to increase the likelihood of harm associated with it. I understand they were concerned about particles and all this other stuff, but nature's providing something during the summer. You should be taking advantage of it. During the winter, you ought to figure out what it is and see if you can add it in a little bit artificially. You're going out and jumping in an immersion or having a sauna or whatever. If you look at the higher latitude places, they're trying to compensate for something, I think, because they don't have light and they don't have all those things. So they're kicking it up with some near infrared.
Yeah. And it's just like the same idea of putting a mask on. And it's like now you're not getting all the natural microbes into your nose. And your nose is probably the most sophisticated filter on the planet.
Yeah.
And now you're covering it up and breathing your own air. It's unbelievably how practical, and you could just look at that in common sense, go, that's not a good idea outside wearing a mask. But it's fear too. And then fear and the media just trying to drive that, which creates cortisol spikes and creates a whole bunch of other responses. Fear itself is its own immunorepressant.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it just, Roger took one of his patients out and took him outside. And the guy said, I really wasn't that into it, but he said, I'll go ahead and do it. He said, I felt so much better. Now, is feeling so much better a physiological response? I think it is.
Yeah.
That's, and my biggest fear is we're generating all this environment. And one of the main things that's coming out of, at least in stuff I'm looking at, is that we're causing an uptick in cortisol across the board. And because the real point, one of the main functions of melatonin is to suppress cortisol and to deal with that response. But everything we're doing is just giving a little bit of boost to cortisol. A little bit of that blue light that you doesn't have the near infrared to complement it. A little bit of this, blocking some of this other stuff from coming in. So it's like we're creating a generation of cortisol addicts. Now, there was a study that showed that if you took schizophrenic and clinically depressed people and you measured their cortisol to or melatonin to cortisol level at midnight, when melatonin should be at its peak, and compared that to control, there's a 5x lower level of melatonin to cortisol in the people that had schizophrenia and depression
Hmm.
relative to the controls. So it's like everything we're doing is suppressing melatonin, increasing cortisol, and it's like we're creating this addiction. And that's really what I almost think it is, because cortisol typically is also followed by a dopamine surge, which is a kind of a reward. So you're almost addicting people to
Mm-hmm.
these effects. And breaking that cycle, and first, addiction is person dependent. Some people are more susceptible to it. One of the things that really frustrates me is that having done what we've done, we've gotten a lot of letters from people who are really struggling. They literally walk into a big box store and they have to leave, and people make fun of them. And I'm sitting there saying, you shouldn't be making fun of them. They're actually the canary in the coal mine that you ought to be listening to, because at some point in time, you may find that have those levels of susceptibility. And it kind of gets down to this idea that you were talking about, how people make fun of certain, you know, off the wall things. I mean, these are real people. They have real feelings. They have real whatever. And it's a shame that we're not paying attention to, especially that the government isn't, you know. So,
Yeah. And the hypersensitivity people, usually the best artists and creators in the world are the ones that are most sensitive to the matrix, if you will. And they never quite fit in, but they're the creatives, and they have these incredible abilities to make music or comedy or all kinds of things. So I don't write people off just based on their ability to be normal, if you will. Normal is actually the thing that what are we adjusting to? I think it was like Krishnamurti said, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to an insane society. And so, and it's not a good idea to just think that what we consider normal to be healthy or good. Because
yeah.
the older I get, the more I want to unplug and be off of my phone and off of the screen and out in nature and spend more time doing the basic things, more just natural rhythmic patterns. And I even think, like, for a good mitochondrial body mind reset, people could do 3 to 5 days with no phone and just spend more time outside, and you'd be shocked as to how many people would benefit from that over all these crazy expensive treatments and drugs and supplements and all the modalities out there that are available. It's like, geez, just do a little reset and go back into nature, and you'd be shocked. I think 99% of people would feel a lot better.
Yeah. And one of our biohacks is, my wife has always struggled with winter, growing up in Kansas, it get cold, dark, whatever. Um, but one of the things we did, started before COVID, I found these little, 60 to $100 uh, enclosures that you take when you go to a sporting event. It's got a clear plastic on all sides. We put that out during the winter, and it could be 30 degrees outside or less, and on a sunny day, and she'll end up having to unzip it to let some air in because it gets up to 70s and 80s, and she'll sit out there and read a book. And my grandsons would come out, and when they were living with us, and they would go out and they'd curl up around her. She put a sheepskin down in this little enclosure, and they'd kind of curl and they'd read their book as well. And I swear that it was such a change to see how she reacted to things. Winter, she still doesn't like winter, but I mean,
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, she could literally almost get sunburned out there, because and all it is just a clear little plastic, very thin. It's letting vast majority of sunlight into that area and heating it up, getting it a little warmer, and I would argue elevating her immune response. And
Mm-hmm.
I just think that the dark hole, we've managed to figure out how to make a cave that we can't tell that it's such a dark hole, because we can't see the darkness. We see only that we've made sure that everybody's convinced it's this really nice, bright, light lit place, with all these pretty colors, but the reality is it's a dark cave because it's gotten rid of all the near infrared and gotten rid of all the UV, and that's not good. If they
Yeah.
actually knew how deep a hole they're in, I think that they would be a little bit more responsive um, to changing it, I guess. But
Yeah. Well, you're doing a good job um, sharing these messages and your ideas and all of your knowledge in a kind way, I've noticed, because I've listened to Dr. Jack Cruz, who's brilliant, and he's got quite the ability to have recall and articulate things, but he's really abrasive, and I think a lot of people shut down. And when you start to call them idiots and not understand that, hey, we're all conditioned by our environments, and at one point we're all ignorant until we find out more about it, and then we make shifts and we make changes. So at one point I was completely ignorant to a lot of the things that now I'm aware of, and there's plenty more. That's what knowledge to me is you keep getting more and more aware of how ignorant you are. And the
yeah,
more it just becomes an infinite rabbit hole of like, geez, I don't know anything, so why would I take it out on my neighbor or anyone that's not aware of the things that I'm aware of? It's like we're all just babies moving through time and space and trying to find out how to live a good life. So you're pretty compassionate, and I like the way you share your message, which is why I was happy to have you on.
yeah. Well, I think that there's nothing more humbling than to look from an opt. I'm an optics guy. You start looking at what the body does and how the structures that it makes on a nanoscale that we could never replicate. We maybe some eons from now we'll maybe figure out how to do it. But the fact that the nature could come up with these structures that are so fascinating. I mean, periodic structures, basic geometry, optics, things of that nature. And now we're even starting to talk through the Guy Foundation. They're starting to talk more about the quantum effects. And you got to be humble because we are dumb when it comes to understanding a lot of this stuff. And sometimes I get a little frustrated when people start saying, typical response I get from some people is that we already understand all that. We know what circadian is. Lighting's just that, and that's it. Um, I'm sorry, I don't want to listen to you anymore because I know that you don't know what you're talking about. Because there's all these other options. Yes, are they hard to prove? Yeah, they're hard to prove, but you know, they're also easy to implement. And like you're jumping in your immersion thing. My son does the same thing. I best I can do is a cold shower. Sorry, I'm afraid the old ticker might go off on in the cold and
Yeah.
monsters. Although I did scouting for a lot of years, and
Hmm.
we one of the things that you had to always do the polar swim to get into camp. So sometimes there's a little ice on the pond when you're doing it. So
Yeah. Well, the best part about all this is that you have that scientific engineer mindset, and it's very complex, and knowledge is so cool. But at the essence of it, all of human history, we were outside and we were in the natural patterns, and it didn't require a whole bunch of knowledge about any of this. And we're
no,
reverse engineering it, and so a lot of it is just getting back to the basics. And you're good about sharing that part of it too, which helps the average person to go, okay, the scientific part we do need a lot of times to make the shift, but then it's like the patterns are not that hard to go back to.
no. I mean, and it's so important because I mean, you guys like we were talking about firefighter. My son, I give him credit. He can handle the night shifts and all that other stuff. But long term, it's got to be wearing things down. And is there anything we can do? Is there anything we can come up with that makes it a little more plausible or a little, because especially women with the elevated breast cancer rates and things like that, you know, nobody wants that. And,
Right.
it's such a, I've done this a lot of, like I say, discovery is what I love. And I've done it a lot of years, but I've never seen an area where there's so much to learn. I mean, it seems, as you say, it's obvious. That's why I guess that's part of the whole benefit of the area that I'm working in is that it's already obvious that something's going on. We're just trying to prove what's the most important part and how can we adapt it to our new lifestyle. And I don't want to rain on everybody's parade and take their little lights away and all that. But I also don't want a generation to grow up with distorted hormone levels and other things that they shouldn't be. Had a really great podcast with this one lady on that was midwifing, and it was really quite interesting. There's a lot of lore and a lot of things that go into having a baby come out, and you know, light is I think a key component to it, and such an amazing way the fetus is exposed to sunlight. So anyway,
That makes a lot of sense. That should be one of the first priorities is for childbirth to change the lighting in that environment.
well, I think so. I mean, I was told my son, and he had a friend that she was pregnant with with her and her husband were having their first child, and he was talking to her and about the light. And he said the next day they were in West Yellowstone. It's cold in West Yellowstone, but she was um, walking around that day with her shirt pulled up. I told him that's okay. You can leave the shirt down, but it's nice that she was thinking about it. But
Yeah.
when you look at how the optics of how a fetus is surrounded by this integrating sphere we call a womb, and for the first part of the pregnancy, it's all near infrared that gets through. And then as the pregnancy progresses, the skin starts to stretch, more wavelengths are allowed in,
Mm.
probably most likely tied to the eye development. And then eventually, you have the birth process where a woman is going through extreme levels of exercise. And, if she had a melatonin, what I look at it is that when you're doing exercise, you're essentially building up this reservoir of melatonin in excess, because it just makes sense that the reactive oxygen species, we would make more antioxidant than we make reactive oxygen species. So that excess is what I believe makes you feel sleepy at the end. But it also is building a capacity for the next event. The mitochondria can respond better. So I can't think of a more exercise intensive thing than giving birth. So I think I think that having women with a full reservoir of melatonin and other things is probably a good thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's cool. Melatonin was a subject. I don't know if you have any time to speak to it, but a lot of people, it's right now this subject matter of like, is it good? Is it bad? Should you take it? Should you not? But I've heard you speak about how much you produce naturally just by getting natural light outside.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I think all these new biosensors are going to come in. Bear in mind that melatonin, I personally don't take large amounts of melatonin. Russ, he's been taking large amounts for a lot of years. He's 85, smart as a whip, or actually, I think he's older than that at this point.
Hmm.
Smart as a whip, and so I can't argue with it. I just don't like to take things. That's just my thing. But that's the kind of the whole crux of the matter. Everybody always equates melatonin levels with the pineal gland, which is circadian driven. And I have no doubt, I mean, in my view, the melatonin created by the pineal gland is being done as an excellent supplement. The brain is still functioning at 80%. It needs the extra antioxidant to deal with the reactive oxygen species did. It's a perfect time to dump a bunch of melatonin into the bloodstream where there's some cells that could also take advantage of the melatonin. So it's an amazing system to supplement what we need. Do I believe it is the only place of melatonin? No. I think that's what our paper showed, because once you do exercise, even at 9 o'clock in the morning, you get this spike in melatonin. It didn't come from the pineal gland, it's coming from the mitochondria. Again, it's from the engineering standpoint, there's a local control and there's a systemic control, you know. And so what I believe the data shows is that melatonin is produced in all cells, particularly by the mitochondria, in response to its local need for dealing with reactive oxygen species. The one time where we get to see it, this other reservoir of melatonin, is when you do heavy exercise. The muscles are intimately interconnected with the circulatory system. So you imagine you're doing all this heavy lifting or doing a lot of exercise. It's the excess melatonin being dumped out ends up in the bloodstream. We see it at 9 o'clock in the morning, but only during a stressor. And that's one of the beautiful things about Glenn's work is he's actually measuring things during stressor events, not, and that's what Theron did and Zoo a little bit. But there's only like 4 or 5 papers that do it. Everybody else does something, does some exercise, then measures their melatonin levels rather than measuring it all the way through.
Mm.
And so to me, there's this hidden reservoir of melatonin that we're seeing in transient effects only because it's always consumed. Now, bear in mind that melatonin is a great antioxidant, but its metabolite, after you oxidize one, it goes down to another metabolite, then another. And so you got like 10 for 1. You do for every 1 molecule of melatonin, you get the effect of walking out 3 or 10 of the reactive oxygen species. And that's all been stuff that Russ has been saying for years. And all we were trying to do was show that, hey, it's really there because you can see this transient response. Now what we're getting to do is look at sweat sensors, and the hope is that we'll be able to show that the skin is responding, generating its own melatonin. And that's why it's really, when you think about it, melatonin is, we already know melatonin is in your sweat and cortisol is in your sweat. And everybody then immediately goes and hits the shower.
Mm.
Question is that if you didn't hit the shower and that melatonin is sitting there on the surface of the skin, does it get reabsorbed in? Is it doing anything that way? I mean, sometimes maybe we're a little too clean on, on what we're doing. But, for a long time, I don't think the prehistoric or even baths were the number one thing for people to think about. But it is changing some of the effects that we're having. That and all the stuff people are putting on their skin now between sunscreens and makeup and all that other stuff. So they're playing with something that may be helpful. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it'd be less wrinkled if they just not take a bath every day. So
Yeah. You wonder. We're doing
I
so
just
much. Sometimes it's better to remove things than add things, you know?
yeah, but I think that melatonin. I mean, unfortunately, I believe that taking. I don't believe in taking a bunch of stuff, so I would never recommend taking large amounts of melatonin. A lot of people I know that are a whole lot smarter than me are, and seeing positive results. I just haven't seen the science enough to make me convince me it's worth doing. I'm more interested in getting out and, like I say, enjoying the sun for all the other benefits. And
Yeah.
it really brings up the problem that we started this whole conversation, or in some ways, is that the body is dealing with thousands of simultaneous equations at one time. You know, melatonin's one of it, cortisol's another, dopamine, estrogen. You got all these different hormones wandering around. You got all these T cells wandering around. You know, it has to survive all that and come up with a solution that is healthy, what we call health. And, you know, focusing in on just one element almost invariably leads to the issue that you just focused on one element and that you may be actually being harmful to something else that you're not measuring, or you're not looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be my caution with the melatonin, especially with
Yeah.
kids.
Right. So I'm curious, I just thought of this, but if you had an elevator moment with RFK, what would you pitch to him to make this shift, this paradigm shift? How would you pitch that to him in a short bit?
Oh, that's hard.
Yeah.
Um, it really is. I mean, I'm not good at it. As my wife will tell you, I don't compress things well. Get to the point. But
Yeah, yeah.
I think that it would, if I had only a little bit of time, I'd try and explain to him that the the artificial lighting that we are putting our children in is actually more harmful than processed food, and that the regulations that we are under are actually making it worse. And I think there's regulations that are associated with the government. I get that. But there are other bodies that have just a more issues, UL. It's a monopoly. It basically tells you that They've now gotten into the circadian stuff, and they're putting in place various tests that you have to run. So regulations are coming not just from the government, but also for outdoor sources. And you really need to look at those. But in general, like I say, I think I'd say that, processed meats are your least amount of your problem. Sunlight is a bigger issue because it's affecting virtually every malady that we are struggling with in a modern society. So,
Yeah, that's a pretty good condensed version of this conversation for sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I definitely would love to see you be able to speak to someone like him and get that paradigm to shift on a bigger scale and to get other people like the Casey and Callie Means thing is going viral, but it's like, how come the viral thing hasn't happened with this light issue? But I hope it does. And that's why we're here, is just to keep spreading the message and keep learning and helping people to change their behaviors, you know?
Well, and I really do appreciate having the chance to talk with you because I do believe that the statement that transparency and getting the information out there, it may be wrong, but I can guarantee you there is not a single paper by any academic organization that doesn't have some wrong assumption, wrong understanding, or just as flat out wrong. Because that's what I do. I spend my time looking for the mistake because that's where you can actually discover something new and innovate.
Hmm.
So, I find it absurd, this whole conversation of disinformation. Yeah, are there some crazy people? I may be one of them. But, the point is that the more we have the conversation and the less we put restrictions on. Right now, I'm just ticked that I have a DOE trying to shove this rule change down my throat, telling me that I can't provide a light source that I think is fundamentally healthier than what they're trying to push. And they don't have any science to back theirs. I've got something for mine. So I think that, they need to get out of the way because the reality is that I make a product. That product, if people don't like it, if it doesn't work, that will not be in the market over time. You know, them
Yeah.
mandating me a product almost institutionalizes us being living. That's what they're literally doing. They are institutionalizing a dark modern cave that has no near infrared in it. That's what they're doing,
It's
and they
incredible.
shouldn't. They shouldn't have the right to do that. I should have to. I mean, I put a lot of stuff online. My wife and I have put a lot of stuff on the line to try and do this because I believe in it, because I think it has eventually a path to maybe helping on some of the cancer issues. But being told I can't do something because they don't have any good reason other than just, oh, we're going to save energy. You haven't saved any energy. You've been a bloody disaster because, from the standpoint of shift, we spent millions and millions of dollars on developing LED technology. Where is it manufactured now? It's manufactured in China and overseas. It's not manufactured here. So you failed. So we need to go and please just get out of the way and let us do some stuff and figure out. And like I say, these podcasts to me are the next way because you can go look just as well as I can what the
Hmm.
papers say. You got a brain, and I'm really hopeful that this new social media thing approach is going to help science in the long run.
Yeah, if we can keep the censorship out of it and protect the First Amendment to let the free exchange of ideas to keep happening, that's most important. I think if they tamper down on that, we're screwed. But right now, I think we got the internet's still quite open. We still have access, which is great. And I'd hope to see you on someone bigger like Joe Rogan or something that would be
Oh yeah,
helpful.
he'd eat my
That'd be
lunch.
awesome. No, it'd be great because he's a curious guy that would, expose you to more people, and then it's just that's how this thing works. Is it's just people sharing ideas and trying to seek
Well,
to learn more about the nature of reality.
well, my last point is that I really appreciate it because it to me, most of the guys like me, we actually kind of almost feed off of somebody puts a challenge in our face or brings up a point like you've been bringing up, and it's just like, okay, well, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah, 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 it's important. And people have become so isolated in so many ways, then it takes such a long time for things to filter down through the journals. And not that journals are terrible all the time, but what you can do in a podcast or what you can do with some of these open forum debates, to me is just so much more efficient and easier to find out if you're wrong or right. And
Absolutely.
so I
Yeah, I
appreciate it.
appreciate. Yeah, I appreciate you. I have one question I always ask everybody. If you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
Ooh, ooh, that my wife is about the most patient person on the face of the earth that I have ever run into. I think that would probably be it. She's allowed me to kind of take the risk. I'm 66 at this point, and but I really believe that what we're trying to do is important, and she has been amazing in a lot of ways. So,
That's amazing. How long have you been married to her?
45 years.
That's incredible. Awesome.
Met each other in seventh grade.
Wow. That's really cool. It's such a rare thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I say, she's special. So, anyway,
So cool. Yeah, so where can people find you? It's Nira Lights. Is it at .com?
NiraLighting.com.
Mm-hmm. Anywhere
And
else that you want to refer people to for resources or information?
well, I would, like I say, I would always recommend Roger Schwelt's MedCram videos, because he really, if they want to dive deep, I mean, he's a doctor. His audience is doctors and nurses. You know that was what I do. And I'd also just say that what we're providing is the closest match I can do economically to matching sunlight, from the standpoint of it's not perfect, but it could get there if we could just get people to be aware that it's important and feel like they want it. Because it's
Mm-hmm.
really, at the end of the day, the lighting companies are only going to respond to customers that wanting something that they're not providing. And that it's frustrating because they have all the tools, they can do it all, and you know even better than what we're doing if they really wanted to. It's just they've convinced everybody that you can get away with this, and I'm not convinced that it's right. So
Right. We got to create the demand by just the paradigm shift inside people's minds of what they want.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there wasn't cold plunges all over the market just 10 years ago. So
Aren't they amazing? I mean, they're everywhere. It seems
they're
like.
everywhere. And it literally wasn't an industry until 10 years ago. So it doesn't take long for these types of things to happen. So I believe in you.
Yeah, well, my son uses a stock tank, so you can do that up in Montana. So,
Yeah,
but
that's
yeah, if
awesome.
I could just convince people to put a little lamp next to their workstation, turn it on, and it'll give them a significant amount of near infrared and maybe offset some of the damage being done by the other.
Awesome. I appreciate you, Scott. This has been really fun, and I know your time's valuable, so I really do appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.